Hey there, everyone. Welcome to this Q&A for the Neutral Ground. My name is Ernie Quiroz. I am one of the co-directors at the Loft Film Festival 2021 edition. Thank you so much to all of you for watching the film and for joining us to watch this Q&A with the director, who I'm going to bring out in just a little bit. But once again, I want to thank you, all of you, for your support. Thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to our members. And of course, as always, thank you to our staff and volunteers. But please welcome from the Neutral Ground director CJ Hunt. CJ, thank you for joining.
Hi. Hi, Ernie. Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, yeah, for sure. This is we're gonna somehow limit this to 20 minutes. There's so much to talk about, so let's just jump right in. I want to start at the end. You talk about, what timeline are we in? Are we in the timeline where this moment was seen as a turning point and maybe finally things have changed, or maybe we roll back?
Mm.
So now, with a little bit more perspective on the film, what timeline do you think we're in? How do you see things going in the last couple of years?
Damn, Ernie coming out hot. Coming out hot. Other Q&As are like, let's start at the beginning. What inspired you? You're like, no. Let's start at the end. Highest stakes question. What timeline are we on? Okay, so thank you again to Loft for having me and for the film. And thank you all for watching this with open hearts. I know it's a real ride and actually a rough ride at times. And I am calling in right now from New York, where after a year where we've seen the most white supremacist monuments come down ever, there's still a giant statue to Christopher Columbus in Columbus Circle, waving at everyone who comes into the Whole Foods, in New York City. So when I think about what timeline we're on, I think about what are the markers, what are the metrics for how we're doing again in the fight against white supremacy.
Mhm.
So one of those is, oh wow, while we celebrate all these monuments coming down, still, one of the metropoles and beacons of supposed liberalism in the North still has this giant monument to a man who did not discover America, but found a bunch of people living here and killed and enslaved thousands of those people, right? He was cutting off hands in Haiti. So that's just like one marker. Another marker that I think about is the way that amnesia and historical amnesia is unrolling now. So much of the movie is us tracking how historical amnesia is literally embodied in Confederate monuments, and even the conversation about Confederate monuments make people want to even further amnesia, make people want to be like, just forget about it. Let's not even look at what any of the Confederacy wrote. It was fine, right? Like, people want this amnesia. A thing that concerns me now is it's not that new Confederate monuments are being built, it's that the same central idea of let's not look back at the past, let's not talk about white supremacy honestly, that's being embodied in laws, right? So as we speak, 10 states have passed bans on divisive concepts in the classroom, right? They're whipping up this fear about someone's going to bust in and teach your kindergartner critical race theory. And because they're able to make so many white parents afraid, they've actually been able to pass in law in 10 states laws that forbid any teaching that makes students feel guilt, anguish, or discomfort. I don't know how you teach slavery without making people uncomfortable. I don't know how you teach the Holocaust. I don't know how you teach women's suffrage. So to me, that is a marker of what timeline that we're on. We are on a time where we are celebrating, and we are celebrating Black freedom and power and all of the moves we've made against white supremacy. But just like in the film has happened over and over again, we are seeing white supremacy mount even harder. And it is not necessarily in young men with torches in the streets, but it is something that is more lasting, which is laws that are going to affect how your children understand history, right? Like, it doesn't matter if we take down a white supremacist monument if we cannot teach our kids what white supremacy is.
Mhm. Yeah, that was actually one of my other questions is, have you felt the battleground shift to now this critical race theory? I mean, we saw just, was it a week ago with the governor of Virginia who ran
Yeah, Glenn
on
Youngkin.
issues. Yeah, yeah. So have in a way have they ceded the monument battle and like, okay, we lost that one. We're not going to go after classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one, the panic over critical race theory is not new. You know, that I was lucky enough in this film to be reading a lot of primary source documents of what the Confederacy was writing in 1860. And one of the main things that they were writing in 1860 and 61, as they were saying, we got to get the F out of the Union, was them saying these Northerners are assaulting us in their pulpits and their press and their schools, and they're teaching our children that slavery is bad. And therefore, we need to break away, or else the North is going to turn the entire country prejudice against us and our peculiar institution, right? So some folks have been worried about slavery getting a bad name in textbooks and their children being uncomfortable with discussing slavery since they had slaves. So this thing isn't new. This is just the latest embodiment of it. And I do think it is a thing that should really terrify us, right? That the same party that was all been talking for the last decade about academic freedom, right, and fighting against censorship, has now passed laws, proposed laws in 24 states whose very idea is to censor teachers so they do not have the freedom to teach our kids like what Robert E. Lee wrote down or how many states like their whole economies were based on trading slaves or what Columbus did in Haiti. All of these things can literally get teachers fired and get schools fined up to $5 million. And that's not a hypothetical. That is something that is happening now. So as we try to take our film to try to teach it in as many schools as possible, those are conversations that we're having to navigate with teachers literally being like, I want to teach this film, but there are consequences by state law if we cover this material. And I think that should horrify anyone who's seen this film.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that's. I think I read one of the reviews of your film is that it's both, it's entertaining and enraging, and you're able to find, you do a good job. That's the job of satire, I guess, is to both entertain and enrage. Well, we can sort of maybe we'll dial it back and maybe let's go back to the
Yeah.
beginning. So
But
let's
also
talk.
also to what you're saying, I think the more we entertain, the more we are able to absorb the outrage.
Yeah.
You know, it's almost like remember when you were like in college or if you're ever at a wedding or in a vibe in sort of a mode where you're like, I'm gonna get drunk. And then sometimes strategically you're like, I need to remember to drink water and I need to remember to eat bread. And for some reason, when you are eating bread, your body is able to absorb a lot more alcohol throughout the night. Right. So I think that it's a similar thing that when you are trying to get people to digest really horrific material about the growth of white supremacy in America and the endurance of it and the state of myths and inequality, that's a really heavy sort of menu to digest for the night. And I have found that if you use humor, you can keep people from just descending into darkness endlessly with the conversation, and they're able to come up for breaths of air, and they're able to absorb, I think, a deeper and more harrowing conversation over the course of 82 minutes than if we didn't have that sort of humor to absorb and cut some of the horror that's part of that convo.
Yeah. Well, as a great person once said, a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down.
Yes, that's my doctor. I don't
Yeah.
trust him.
So let's go all the way back to the beginning. Talk about the progression from, as you put it, a couple of janky YouTube videos to now this film that premiered at Tribeca and is on PBS and is kind of going everywhere now.
Thanks.
How did this evolve?
In 2015, I didn't think of myself as a documentarian, or I wasn't like, I need to go out and make documentary films. All I wanted to do was make satire, right? I wanted to figure out how to use jokes to poke at people who refuse to change and show the absurdity of people who refuse to change or who refuse to, acknowledge truth. So one of my first published pieces was as lawmakers were debating about whether to take down the Confederate flag after Dylan Roof had massacred 9 Black people in a church in Charleston. And so one of my first published satire pieces was called 5 Hot New Looks for the Confederate Flag, which was like, all we got to do is, this is a design challenge, right? That like, if we designed the Confederate flag to be more in line with how it's been used historically, we would not argue about what it means, right? So around the same time, we started this film, and I thought that it would just be a video satire piece. It would be a video version of the same thing I just published, but we're doing redesigns of monuments, right? Of how could we redesign this monument that makes you forget that it absolutely celebrates slavery and, you know, was unveiled by segregationists and has existed as a sign of white supremacy for 130 years. But I think as we filmed more, and as the stakes of that fight got higher, you know, it had only been a couple weeks after we started filming when contractors were driven off the job by violence and death threats, and where the courts locked up this removal, making it impossible. So when you see the sort of stakes moving up, you're like, yikes, I think this is more than just a couple of jokes about, oh, would you be okay if we took the racist off, but just kept the horse, just the horse, that's good for you? Like, it becomes harder to make that style of joke as the stakes get higher. So I'm really grateful to Darcy McKinnon, who's my producer, and my editor, Jane Geisler, and the folks at Firelight Media, because I think all of those people took me, who was an aspiring comedian, and turned me into a filmmaker by saying, okay, this is what verite filmmaking looks like. This is what this could actually be if we took this seriously as a documentary. And that's, you know, as things got worse and longer and more complicated, and it became clear that the myths people are saying actually go back 100 years, we couldn't make anything but sort of a deeper documentary look.
Yeah. Talk about those screenings that you've been having. You know, it's obviously an odd time, and you probably can't be in person as many screenings as you can, but is the dialogue happening? I mean, do you fall into the trap of like you're just going to preach to the choir with this film? I mean, have you been able to start people down the path to enlightenment?
I feel really lucky that we're in this hybrid situation, so that we're able to. We didn't think that we'd be able to get to this many festivals, right? So I thought that, especially because we premiered at Tribeca and then we're on POV a month later, or just a couple weeks later, I was like, okay, our festival run is done. But the idea that festivals like Loft are like, hey, we don't care if you've been on TV already. We have an audience hungry to talk about this film. That's been really exciting because we've been able to get to a lot of places. And even folks who watch a pre-recorded conversation like this sort of follow it up in trying to talk to us online, which is really nice too. So I think the simple answer to your question is we have not been flipping any neo-Confederates. So if that's what you're hoping for, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Also, why are you still hoping for that if you just watched this movie? This whole movie is about why we should not be spending our time chasing the most extremist of white supremacists and hoping that changing their hearts is the key to race relations. But I do think that it has been allowing a lot of white folks a really easy but also really rigorous way into a conversation about what it means to be white in America, right? So a common moment that we have in a lot of screenings is people wanting to talk about my dad and talk about, you know, how much they enjoy the scene where he's talking to me and he's busting my myths and talking about, oh, you didn't know that you were Black, and we're talking about what it means to be Black in America. And the thing that I often say to audiences is that I think what we're responding to there is what it looks like to talk honestly about race in a family, and the idea that you cannot raise a Black child without that kind of conversation, without talking to them about history and what race means for you. And then I ask white parents to raise their hands if they have ever talked to their child about being white. And that is an uncomfortable and productive moment that happens in audiences, because that is very few parents. Because I think it is easy to raise a white child and have them believe you're just the norm, and other people are diverse and other people have a race thing to work through because race belongs to them, and we're just the normative category. So I think the most productive thing that has been happening has been white folks being able to talk to white folks they love about what it means to be white and what, they owe in terms of justice and helping protect people in this world. And then I think the other thing is that I think it's allowing Black folks and non-white people who are younger a fun way into this conversation where they can see themselves. So many students that we work with are like, oh my God, I've never even heard about the rebellion of 1811, right? The German Coast Uprising. And that's big for me too. I hadn't heard about that before this film. And it's like, you telling me 500 of us rose up and marched on New Orleans to kill our masters? Like that's some Game of Thrones level stuff, right? Like we're like, oh my God, that's Khaleesi. It's like we don't even need to look to Khaleesi. We have examples in our own history. So I think more than just making white people reflect, I want to make communities of color feel like we can see ourselves.
Mhm.
We have a way to respond to racists who are gaslighting us that this war was never about slavery. And that it also shows students like it's not that hard to make a documentary. I'll tell students all the time, like, this is just a fancy TikTok that took 5 years. That like kids are doing better stuff on TikTok now about being like, did you know Columbus tried to have sex with a manatee? Here are the receipts, right? Like kids make that stuff on TikTok now. So I'm hoping they see this and it's not like them being like, huh, how do I be a Ken Burns? I hope it makes them be like, oh, CJ just like found a bunch of receipts from racists, had voice actors read them, and we learned history. Like I think that's a different model of documentary for young folks growing up too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that yeah. I mean, that's part of I guess you could say, the lost cause and sort of the complicity of the North of like suppressing that history
Yeah.
for for whatever reason. And that's something that I want to talk about is the North's contribution to the lost cause. Like why that narrative? Why did the losers get to define their narrative? How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, we have this question, right? We have this idea that it's the winners who write history. And then we're like, so weird that the losers in this case, right? How did these losers get thousands of monuments to their loss, right? Name another losing army that's been able to build thousands of monuments to themselves that are glorious and talk about the glorious cause. You cannot name that because the Confederacy is the only one. And I think it pushes us to realize that is only possible because they did not lose, right? They lost on the battlefield, but they absolutely won the peace, right? There is a horrifying moment in this film in 1877 in history where we see Reconstruction being betrayed by white Northerners who are feeling impatient and don't actually want to commit to making Black people citizens. So the very same people, in New Orleans, the members of the White League, folks who were traitors to the nation because they joined the Confederacy, and folks who were double traitors again because during Reconstruction they stormed the State House and killed cops in the streets and killed federal workers and tried to overthrow the biracial state government, right? These are the original Capitol rioters. They held the State House for 3 days in New Orleans. These folks then became the government. Can you imagine if we were like, oh, that shaman guy who attacked the Capitol is now the governor? Like that would be insane.
He's
to
from
us.
Arizona, by the way.
I mean, so not impossible, but the idea that like these folks would have gained power and become the new government, we could not picture that with the Capitol rioters at all. That they would become governors and mayors and senators, and we could not picture that they build statues to themselves saying the day January 6th where we stood up for freedom. And that is exactly what happened with the Confederacy, with the North abetting that and with the North striking a deal with that. So I think, when I think about all these movies like Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation and all these things that were made in the North and all these, Dixie was popularized by a guy in New York. When I think about all these things, I think about this moment now about how easily the nation is forgiving some of those Capitol rioters, right?
Mm.
That white folks in the North are always hungrier to make up with white terrorists than they are to actually ensure the protection of Black and brown people. And so when we're watching all these people escape justice who literally tried to hang Mike Pence, who went into the Capitol, I think those of us who worked on this film or those who study history really closely are like, yes, this is the pattern. This is what happens.
Well, yeah, it's not only to the economic benefit, but it's just, it's easier to ignore the truth than to have that reckoning.
Yeah,
Which is
remember when
why,
people were literally saying it's divisive to try to hold Trump accountable and try to hold those rioters accountable. That is divisive. That is moving
yeah,
backwards. We need to move forwards and get
yeah,
over it.
yeah.
And that is the same narrative that happened after the Civil War. And I bet the same narrative, Ernie, that you and me both grew up on, right? Like I did not hear that the Civil War happened and then it was decades of terror and abandonment of Black people. I heard the Civil War happened and then the North and South figured out how to get along again. Like we are not told that reconciliation story as a horror story. We're told like it was brother against brother, and then the brothers married each other's wives, and they, like this grand reunion. Rather than like, no,
Hmm.
the nation was pieced back together through terrifying Black people, and
Yeah,
that is not something I learned in history.
yeah, yeah. Before we run out of time, how can people continue this conversation? How can they contact you, or sort of keep in touch with what you're doing and the film, and give me some social media things
Great, please.
yeah.
I mean, the easiest thing is you will be able to watch this on for free after this festival. You'll be able to watch it for free on pov.org. So all you just have to remember is the website pov.org, and we're right on the main page. And if you can't remember that, just Google the Neutral Ground film, and you'll be able to find it. And then also, we are trying to work with as many teachers as possible. So if you are a teacher who wants to bring this into your classroom, if you're like, oh my gosh, can we talk about monuments in Arizona? And, can we talk about the places that did not join the Confederacy but are deeply part of this history? Can we get the director of the film in? I would gladly come to your classroom. Just hit us up on the website. We're at neutralgroundfilm.com, and we have a special tab just for teachers.
Okay. And then is there like your own sort of personal Twitter or whatever to keep up to
Yeah,
date on all the
I'm on
projects?
Instagram at CJ Hunt, and I'm on Twitter at Go CJ Hunt. But you can find me anywhere. Like the bat signal for finding me is just using the hashtag the neutral ground, because that's where we are talking to folks about the film.
All right, very cool. Well, in the very short window of time that we have left, and this is going to be another huge thing, we saw at the end of the film, you were there at Charlottesville. You
Yeah.
were there. And it's just, here we are, what are we, 4 or 5 years later? The trial is just, we're in the middle of the trial. Talk about what it was like to be there, sort of reflecting back, and in the trial, one of the main things that they're saying is that this was a coordinated effort by these groups, that they were there to incite violence. What was your take being there on the ground?
Yeah. Uh, I will answer that with a question. What was your take on the person in the film who took off their shirt to be safe? What was your reaction to that character?
Well, yeah, he was there. He says, "Oh, I'm just here to have fun," and but he was there chanting, shouting, and then when he was cornered, he's like, "Hey, I'm here
Mhm.
to have fun."
And when you're talking about that character, do you call him a kid or a man?
I mean, he looks like a kid. He looks like a kid. Yeah.
If he was Black, would we call him a kid?
No.
So to me, that's everything, right? To me, that's why the scene is in there. And
Yeah.
most consistently, audiences will call that kid who took his shirt off.
Yeah.
And even me and my own team, I'm like, oh, we need to do the scene with where the kid takes his thing off. And if we were most generous, in the most generous scenario, that person is 17, right? That person is 17 to mid 20s. But if there was a black person, a young black man who was 17 years old, who traveled to a city that is not his own, marched through the night, openly intimidating folks with torches, and then was in the streets the next day, fighting cops and causing violence. Under no circumstances would we call that black teenager a kid. But with whiteness, we call that person a kid. And we come up with stories about how he could have gotten mixed up among these real terrorists, right? And what is the story that some of our kids were just there and were mixed up, or how did that even happen? We do not look at him and say that is a terrorist. That is a terrorist who traveled to another city to do a terrorist action and is responsible for being part of this group that took lives. So I think what will happen with this trial and the conversation about Charlottesville has everything to do with the simple question of, when white people commit terrorism, are we able to call it what it is?
Yeah.
It's just throughout history, right? Do we call it when they're burning and killing people indiscriminately in Tulsa, we call that a race riot, right? In Louisiana, we called it the Louisiana outrages, right? In Colfax and Coushatta in Louisiana, when the White League was just massacring people, plaques are still there that call that the Colfax riot. And I think in the same thing with Charlottesville and the raid at the Capitol, it is just a basic question. When white people commit terrorism, can we call it what it is? And that is the core question that is also behind every one of these monuments, right? At what point are we like, maybe when we put white men who attack the government on pedestals, maybe that gives other white men who want to attack the government the wrong message, right? Maybe these two things are connected, and we don't make those connections until we see someone carrying the Confederate flag into the State House, right? I mean, into the U.S. Capitol. We're like, oh yeah, maybe all this honoring of the nation's biggest traitors and terrorists is having an effect on those who would move against the government today. So that's my thought on Charlottesville. It was incredibly traumatic and all of the things that you see in this film. But I think the thing that should horrify you is not how scary it was or how many people were hurt on that day, but whether the nation has the resolve to call that terrorism and to hold folks accountable.
Yeah.
Because that's the story of our inability to do that is why we're even talking about the Confederacy. It's why there are still 2,000 Confederate monuments, memorials, street names up, right? Like, we have been unable to gather the moral courage to say that when white folks attack the government and kill people indiscriminately, that is terrorism and that is not part of the American story.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the Capitol riots in sort of real time on Facebook and everything. Everyone saying, like, if this was a Black Lives Matter group, with the police, where were the police? Where were they? They just sort of stood back and sort of let it happen, and if this was any sort of minority group, if
that was two black men on the steps just with a sign, they would have been zip tied and sprayed and all of the things.
Yeah.
So I think that's also like the most haunting thing about any of the footage from Charlottesville that you will see, even in this movie, is the absence of the police, right? That, like, where do you see the police? You see them in a line protecting the Robert E. Lee monument, and people openly brawling and beating each other in the streets, and the police just standing back. So I hope that the end of the film is inspiring, and I hope it is haunting, and I hope it makes us ask questions about how dead is the Confederacy? What are the ways that the Confederacy still lives in what's happening in our schools and what we allow in the policing of Black bodies in the streets and the protection that we give to white terrorism? Like, all of these are questions that I want you to feel powerful, and I want you to see what incredible change that we are able to make, literally pulling statues down, changing laws, but the Confederacy still lives, and that is something that I think that we must fight every day.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just starting by looking yourself in the mirror and saying, what part do I have in this, and how can I change that? No
Yeah.
matter what color your skin is, no matter whether you're white or black, you have a part in this, and it begins with asking, what is your part, and what.
And I think it's helpful that the film is personal, right? Like the film, I hope brings home this idea that history is personal.
Yeah,
So many people when they're talking to us are like, "Yeah, I'm thinking about how my grandma was really like, 'Don't tread on me, the South will rise again,' and I'm realizing that that's pretty messed up, or I'm realizing that I've never really thought about why we associate the only model of rebels in the South with actual terrorists instead of the rebel slaves who found freedom and turned the course of the war, or the interracial rebels who sat at lunch counters and changed segregation, right? Like I think people are asking deep questions about what stories they tell themselves in their heads, stories about police violence, stories about that kid in Charlottesville. And I think hopefully it makes people realize, oh, this is personal. This is not a theoretical thing about, oh, how do we reckon with history? It is about what stories have I continued to tell in my family and in my own head that enable violence, and then how do I stop those stories, and how do I show up for justice?
yeah, and we thank you for sharing your own personal journey, because we see that transformation in you from, as your dad pointed out, of where you denied your own race for a long time, and then you were able to confront that yourself, which was painful for you.
Yeah.
But we need to do that as a nation.
How do we do that as a nation when you don't have a dad who will comedically dunk on you in your own movie? That's the question. How do you gather the moral courage to ask yourself hard questions when your dad is not embarrassing you on your own film? That's the real work.
Well, maybe I think you and your dad have helped a lot of people to do that. So
Thanks so
this
much.
movie will be the nation's dad in some way.
Yes, yes. I'm so glad for this movie to be the nation's dad. So yeah, go share it with a teacher. It's free. It's rare that a thing is free literally for the entire country. So if you know a teacher who would love it, if you know somebody who needs to have a hard convo with folks in their family about race, send it to them. If you know black and brown folks who are excited about ways to see ourselves in history, whereas we only normally see like whips on a back, share it with them, and then let me know what you think. I'm very thirsty, I'm very active online, and we'll talk to you endlessly about your favorite scenes, or about the score. Sultana Isham's beautiful score right now is just nominated for an IDA award for best
Oh,
score. So I will talk to you about any of the things. I'll see you online on the hashtag the neutral ground.
yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, CJ, and thank you everyone for this post-screening conversation with the Nutriground.
Thank you, Ernie, and thank you, Loft. Everyone take care of each other.